is Anita Sherman. I'm the editor of the Culpeper Times, and in partnership with Culpeper Media Network, we are interviewing local veterans in this area for a program that's going to be aired on Culpeper Media Network. Today is Thursday, September 29th, and with us today is William C. Chase Jr. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for joining us today. Okay. Now, what we're going to do, I'll ask you a series of questions, but first of all, going back a little bit, I want to find out, because I know you're living in Culpeper now and Stevensburg area, where you were born, a little bit about your parents, and also any siblings or parents that were involved in military, and then kind of leading up to your entrance into the military. So let's start there.
Born in Clearfield, Pennsylvania, which is a small town in the Susquehanna River, and my father was a country lawyer, and he had an old sense of values. When my coming up, why things like when I turned 16, I know now why kids kind of expect a car. In my day, my father wouldn't even let me drive his car. He said I wasn't mature enough, so So I went an entire year with a license and not a car to drive, so I told him I'd like to quit school and buy a car. And he said that was fine, he'd help me get a job. So he got me a job at the age of 16 in the coal mines. So I worked there for 3 months. I got my car, but I decided it was just as easy to go back to school. And the coal miners had a big impact on me because they all said, you know, that's fine, you're 16 or 17 and we're making $1.25 an hour. We're 45 and we have 5 kids and we're making $1.25 an hour. So anyway, that was my background, and from there, when I got out of high school, I hadn't done very well academically, so I got an appointment to West Point, but I failed everything but the physical fitness. So I went.
Give us a sense of time frame. Is this like the
mid-50s? That was 1955 when I got out of high school. So I went down to Washington to Sullivan's Prep School, which was a prep school that was especially taught you the entrance exam for a year so that you pretty well knew it. And one of the reasons I was interested in West Point in the military was my grandfather had been class of 1899 at West Point. And he'd had a very interesting career in World War I. He commanded an engineer regiment, and so he had a big influence on me, although he never encouraged me to go. But anyway, after I got out of prep school, I passed the entrance exam, so I graduated from West Point in 1960 and went into the Army. And that's how I got into the Army in the first place.
All right, that's what I was going to lead up to, is how you chose Army. So there was no enlisting or drafting. You went right from West Point.
Yes, no, the draft was in effect then. Well, it went into effect during the Vietnam War, but no, as a matter of fact, about 7 of us, we consider ourselves real heroes in high school. We're all going to join the Marines, and none of the 7 of us joined the Marines, but 2 girls did from our class. So that kind of set us back. But anyway, that's how I got into the Army.
So now involved with West Point and all that. So what kind of training and did you experience there, and then how did that segue into your going overseas?
At West Point, the training. Well, during the summers we would have military training. During the fall and winters it was all academic, and it was a very tough. Everybody took the same curriculum in those days, and you were graded on every subject on every day, so that they would, when you went in, you'd sit down, they'd give you an opportunity to ask questions, specific questions, and then they'd say take boards, and they'd do the lesson from the day before. So I always had to have what they called an academic coach. It would be a man a class ahead of me helping me the night before prepare. So, but I've often said that system was made for me because I'd memorize a whole lot that I couldn't always understand. So it's still my case.
So from West Point, then, I know now we're talking about the early 60s. How did you get your appointment? I mean, because I know you served in Vietnam, so.
Well, I went first, I went to airborne school, paratrooper school at Fort Benning. I went to branch school first, and then I did 3 years or 4 years in Hawaii, but I angered a few officers there because at the time I thought I was getting out of the Army and I was going to go to law school. So I just basically didn't care, and I angered some of the field grade officers. So they sent me down to Christmas Island in 1962 as basically a guinea pig for the nuclear tests. I witnessed 25 nuclear tests, and they were just about 30 miles from us, and they would drop the bombs, and we'd watch them drop them, and then they'd come down in parachutes, and then they had us face away before they exploded them. And then it would knock you, the force would knock you forward 8-10 feet. And then you'd wait till the fireball dissipated, till the clouds came over it, then you would go back and you could turn around. You had goggles on, and you could see it was daylight. It was at night when they did it, and it would just be instant daylight. Even through these heavy goggles, that you couldn't see 120 watt light through them, but you could see the atomic blast. So I was part of the nuclear tests in '62.
Guinea pig, for sure.
Yeah, that's basically what it was. They kept a badge around their neck. They measured it then. I don't know if it was Rads or Röntgens, but they never checked our badge till we left there. But I loved the South Sea Islands.
I'm sure.
I did and Jack Daniels was only about $1 a bottle down there, so. Stole a Jeep from a colonel and crashed it into the governor's house down in Samoa to give an old Samoan lady a ride. She'd never been in a vehicle before, and things like that. And then Fiji Islands, I had a sergeant traveling with me who I was always carrying $20,000 in cash because I was paying these different outposts. And we'd left word in the Macombo Hotel to wake us up at 6 o'clock, and because we were getting a flight. So it was still dark out, and this sergeant, we'd been drinking that night, and the sergeant was screaming, shouting, and I looked over in the haze of the night. There was a night light there. I saw a native in a sarong skirt with no shirt. He had shark's teeth around his neck. I thought he was choking the sergeant, but he was shaking him. The sergeant was screaming, so we jumped up and we knocked the daylights out of this guy. Well, he was the bellboy. They didn't have a telephone system. So there was the wake-up call was coming around. So I'm not welcome in the Macombo Hotel anymore.
But
down
you know,
in
I was
Fiji.
curious about those nuclear tests too, because what were they testing? They were testing
Oh,
how the human body would react at certain
No, they
distances?
were testing the size. They never knew how big they were going to be. We used to bet on how big they were, and one of them, the biggest one, was 15 megatons, which Hiroshima was 2.5 kilotons. And 100 kilotons is 1 megaton, and this was 15 megatons. So my roommate and I had been drinking at night, or the night before, so we hadn't gotten out of bed. We were supposed to get out and go with these goggles to
Well,
a
you
point.
told me you had the goggles on, right?
For every test but this one,
Okay.
15
All
megatons.
right, okay.
And we were in the hooch, which were wooden hooches, and this bang went off, and the boards were coming in. They blew our barracks in because it was too big, and luckily we were both facing away from the blast because we knew what it was as soon as it went. But that was 15 megatons. But what they would do is measure each shot. They'd send them down by 3 parachutes from a B-52, and they'd get within 100 feet above the ocean, and then they'd detonate them. So then they would measure on how big they were, and they never knew exactly how big they were going to be. So.
What I find interesting is this nuclear testing going on during that Vietnam crisis. I mean, were they contemplating perhaps using those?
No, this wasn't during Vietnam. This was '62.
This is before. Okay.
It was the last above ground test. And although some people back in Hawaii in the 25th Division were going over to Vietnam as pure advisors. They didn't even carry weapons. They used to go out on operation without weapons. So Vietnam was going on then, but it was just barely starting. And Dien Bien Phu, the end of the French War, was in '54, I think. And this was, so it was just starting. And no American unit had been involved yet, but they were. So we were just. This was the last above ground test from Johnson Island. They used to shoot them up by a rocket, but down in Christmas Island, which was owned by the English, why they would have the bomb drops from planes, and that's what I was down. And actually, they were testing communications rather. At the time, I was in the Signal Corps, and I wasn't in the infantry yet. So they would test to see if they knocked. We had crypto equipment. We had very high frequency and different types, and they would see what effect the bomb drops had on communications. They were just testing that. They had no idea about fallout, I don't think at all. They just, it was the initial blast that they, because as I said, they didn't even send us back to check our badges to see how many Roentgens we took. About 5 or 6 years ago, I belonged to the National Association of Atomic Veterans, and they gave us an address to write to find out how many Roentgens you had, and I wrote to them and got it. I've lost the paper, but I don't know what that means anyway. So
you know, that's one of the things I was going to ask you too about Agent Orange and all of that, because I know that some veterans that have come back from that are affected by that now. Well,
that's I've got skin cancer, and I had a heart attack in 1975 when I was 38 and in good shape, and they now have tied that to Agent Orange, ischemic heart disease, and it was there again. I was with the South Vietnamese in a place called the Pineapple Forest, and I was the only American advisor with them. And the Americans, we had an operation called Ranch Hand, and a Marine battalion had been damn near decimated in that area. So the Vietnamese were going through to see if there was any leftover Viet Cong. Well, the ranch hands, the C-123s, were coming over, dumping Agent Orange right on top of us while we were down there because they didn't coordinate it with us. So I can remember looking up at them and how it was running off my helmet like rainwater, and looking up at it, and I can remember how it burned my eyes, Agent Orange, and that's what it was.
So did it come down like as a liquid, as like
yes,
rain or a powder?
Like rain.
Rain.
Just like rain. And so but that was because we were a Vietnamese unit that they weren't paying attention. Although in the 173rd, we had a battalion commander that, a deputy, he was deputy brigade commander, a full colonel. He had a doctor's degree. He wasn't well suited for the infantry because he became the president of Wilson College, and a hell of a nice guy. But we would take turns when we first got into the unit. We would take turns flying with him, the majors, flying with him while he would check things out. So he went out. We had the B-52s coming in. They called them daisy cutters that they'd drop. They would be great big long bombs that would strip the trees and everything else. So he was off, we were off to the side, and 2 sorties of this came in and dropped bombs. And then he said, let's go in and check it out. And I was in the back seat. I said, sir, we don't have clearance from the Saigon yet. He said, well, it looks like they're done. They had 2 sorties. And I said, yeah, but they sometimes divert other people because of the bad weather over in another part. They'll bring those sorties over. He said, well, we'll wait for a minute. So finally he said, well, we've waited long enough, we're going in. So we went in. Well, I'll never forget looking on both sides of the helicopters, looking at these damn telephone poles dropping. Well, we were flying every way but upside down as these bombs were going around us and just knocking us the hell out of us. He said he guessed he was wrong. So, but.
And at the time, I'm sure they didn't even fully realize the impact that Agent Orange was going to have.
Oh no, the Agent Orange, no. It was just defoliant. That's all. And the same thing you'd spray on a farm or something. No, they had no idea because they never till after the war was over and they started having all these birth defects and then people having different illnesses.
But you stayed in the Army, clearly.
Yes, my father was coming over to visit us in 1961. We'd been there just a year, and he coming over to see his first grandchild. And second day there, as a matter of fact, it was December the 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. And we lived in Waianae, which was just about 10 miles from Pearl Harbor. And anyway, he died there. So I no longer had the support I needed to go to law school. And of course, the loss, and I just decided to stay in the Army.
Okay. So now let's go forward. So how did you get your commission and be sent over to Vietnam, or were there other things that happened before that?
Well, I was commissioned in 1960, the day I got out of West Point, and then I was trying to think. Then I finished. I was in the Army. I was part of the Army Ranger Committee and went through Ranger School in 1964, and then I went on to the Infantry Career Course at Fort Benning. And then from there, I went to Fort Knox, and I was Basic Training Company Commander for a year. And from there, I went to my first year in Vietnam in '66 and '67, where I was an advisor to the South Vietnamese, one of their infantry battalions. And then I came back and people asked me what was the toughest part of Vietnam. I said, actually, it was in between at Dickinson College. I went to Dickinson College and as ROTC instructor. Well, it was during the days of the Students for Democratic Society, which I used to just laugh at. I didn't care about the professors burning their draft cards and all this. And I had a lot of friends in the Army War College, and we used to have parties at our house and have the Army War College colonels come and these hippie professors come. And it was always interesting. There was never any violence, but it was always good discussion. So, but that wasn't the tough part. And then they would have symposiums, and they always had me go to represent the department. And they'd start at 7 o'clock at night and go till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning.
So I'm wondering if that was difficult because there was so much
no, the thing,
a lot of bad sentiment about that war.
No, that didn't bother me because, as I told the newspapers, talked to us from time to time, I said, hell, I wouldn't want to share a foxhole with any of those people. Anyway, but what the tough part was, I was also a death notification officer. So I had to go out. I had the county outside the town of Carlisle, out in Cumberland County. And I would go around to these farmhouses and knock on their door and tell them that their son or their husband was killed. And it was, I always put on my dress blue uniform to do it, and hell, I'd have tears running down my cheeks so that they knew without my even saying anything. I had a set speech that the president is sad to tell you that. So that was the toughest part of the war for me, was facing those people and telling them their loved one was killed.
How often did you have to do that? I mean,
oh, I don't know. I probably had 7 or 8 of them in the year that
So you actually had a stint in Vietnam, then you came back, and then
2 years, and then I went back over and I was an operations officer for the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which had 4 line battalions. I was with the 2nd of the 503rd, and I was their operations or S3 officer, running the operations from a helicopter, usually.
What was, I know my husband was in Vietnam, served in Vietnam as well, in the Army, and he will share off and on different experiences, but what was that experience like over there? I mean, I'm sure you saw a lot of casualties and...
Oh, yes, yes. That was the hard part. But as far as performing day to day, that was what you trained for. So we'd practice and practice and practice for 10 years to get there to do that stuff for 5 years, so that if you just thought it through and tried to, but there again, the tough part was that you might make a decision the best you could do and you'd get people killed. And I used to play that back in my head, but I can live with it today because I always did the best I could. And sometimes it turned out bad. And that's what I tell people here in the courthouse where I work now, is you can make a mistake and anything to worry about. If nobody dies, you can always apologize and redo it. But if somebody dies because of your mistake, it's tough to apologize. I was on a hill, and this guy, he'd been over there for 7 or 8 months. He was an engineer advisor. And so he was out on his first, as I later found out, he'd never come out of the base camp. This was his first operation. And he radioed me as I was running the division operations. And he wanted me to send out a case of Cokes, which we'd do if there was a lull in the battle or something, we'd take a case. And this guy wanted, I said, what in the hell is he talking about? Because we'd been engaged. And I told him to drink out of the well, get local water. Well, I didn't tell him to drink out of the well. I said, get local water. Well, what we did in the infantry was we would dip our canteens into the rice paddies and fill it up, and we'd throw in a whole bunch of these iodine tablets and then a whole bunch of Kool-Aid, so that it tasted like hell, but you didn't get anything other than maybe dysentery from it. But and that's what I meant for him to do. Well, he went up and used a well, and you never used a well. And when he pulled it up, it had been booby-trapped with a US 155 millimeter cannon round. So it blew them and killed 2 of them. They were up a hill at a hooch getting it up the well. And I meant for him to get his water out of there, but it was combat. And one other time I was with them when some people were getting water out of the well, but the Viet Cong quite often would throw bodies down the wells, and that well had a body in it, so people were drinking it, didn't like the smell. So you can drink a whole lot of water buffalo pee and different things else other than drink water in with a body or with a booby trap in it.
So when you went back to Vietnam that second time, then how long were you there?
Another year that time.
Another year.
Yeah.
So what is your strongest memories from that? Because I know there's a story with a particular major, and we do want to get to that. I don't want it to be in there out of sequence, but I do want to touch on that.
Well, he was there the first year when I was an advisor with the Vietnamese. You want me to go into that story?
Sure, I'd like to, for us to talk about that.
It was, we went out to battalion. They had us first, they gave us kind of a break-in period before we went out to a battalion, and I went out, and my particular officer that I was advisor to was a Vietnamese major, Major Thao, Thao. And Major Thao he was a very strong Catholic, and he had remained loyal to GM when he was out in the field in the Special Forces with the South Vietnamese. And when GM was having his palace overrun, he was the president at the time, he radioed out for Thao to come in and help out for the defense because he knew he could trust Thao. So Thao came rushing into Saigon. When he got there, they'd already assassinated GM, or not GM, yeah, GM, assassinated the president. So they took Thao and put him down a dungeon for 1 or 2 years in chains. And then they brought him out and they sent him up to I Corps as a battalion commander. I mean, the guy was so capable, he should have been.
And he survived that prison time.
He was the most decorated officer in their army. And when he came up to I Corps, they just put him in a regular battalion. So, and he was a graduate of Dalat, which was their military academy. And that was so Thao always treated me like a brother when I went with him, since I was a military academy graduate. Well, he really liked that. And we lived together for 5 or 6 months, and it was a Vietnamese habit that when we'd go back to the town of Tam Key, when you walked down the street with two Vietnamese men, they would hold hands. So Tao and I would hold hands, which would get whistles and everything else when a truckload of U.S. Marines went by. Why, they wondered about that. But and I'm not a Catholic, but I used to go to church with them and everything, and of course eat their food, which was a real challenge in itself. And so anyway, and we used to, we lived in a bunker. He had a separate bunker than I did, but we were basically a mobile battalion. And I would sometimes be alone in my advisor bunker, and sometimes I'd have an Australian working for me, and sometimes another American. So it just varied from time, and then sometimes nobody. But Tao, we went out on an operation, and the one before had been a very dangerous, and I said that it had turned bad for me because at Ranger School we got into long-range patrol a lot. Mm-hmm. And when you crossed a danger area, which could be a road or a stream or anything like that, you sent people across and they'd fan out, and then you'd bring the main body across, and then the rear, when they came out, then everybody'd move together, forward together. And we had the danger area is what we call a flume, the French word for it. It was a huge canal to water the rice paddies. And I was down in the flume because it was about a 10-foot bank on each end. Well, the Vietnamese are 5'2", 5'3" in height, so they couldn't get up and out. So there was a couple of roots there, so I would lift them, and I lifted a couple hundred of these guys up. Well, when I went to get up, the root broke, so I went tumbling back down in. I couldn't get out, so they didn't wait for me. They moved on. So I went down about quarter mile, half mile down the flume till I could finally get out, and I didn't know which way to go. Whether to go back to the hill we'd left, but I knew that we had mines and everything and guards there, so I was afraid they'd shoot me.
Are you pretty much alone at this time?
I'm very alone, all alone. So I shoot an azimuth, which the Ranger School, and so I caught up to them, and it's funny now, but at the time, I heard them all talking. They were very noisy, and they were in a rice paddy, and there was a row of trees. So at the time, I spoke Vietnamese, and so I was pushing through this breakthrough, and I was afraid they'd hear me coming and shoot at me. So I held my hand up, and I was that close to saying "Co Von Me," which meant American Advisor. But I looked at them, and they had these smudge pots that they used to have to keep the bugs away from the rice. And something didn't look right. Well, what it was a total Viet Cong outfit with floppy hats, so I damn near told them I was an American Advisor. So I backed up, and I started that hand grenade, started to throw in a hand grenade, but then I realized that if I'd done that, my battalion would have turned around and shot at the noise. And so I just reshot the azimuth and caught him on the hill. And I was kind of pushing my way through, and a little Vietnamese, about 5'4", turned around to see who was pushing through, and he had a mortar on his shoulder, and he hit me between the eyes or right in the middle of the forehead, and I had a great deal of blood coming down from it. So when I finally caught up to Tao, Tao said we need the doctor, which the Vietnamese word is bác sĩ. And their doctors, they meant usually that they had 1 year of college and they were going to become a doctor. So that's what their doctors were, pre-med, 1 year of pre-med. And so he cleaned, they had no alcohol, so he cleaned it with mosquito repellent. And then he reached in his pocket and pulled out a needle that was about 3 inches long. In the other pocket, he pulled out a ball of regular string, and that was what he's going to, so I finally had to really say no, that was it. So we went back that time on that operation, but then it was the very next one where Tao we were in a village. We'd gone out at night, and we came down to this village, and it was Viet Cong, and we had a light firefight to come into the village, and then we were engaged in another one, and we were calling for artillery support. Well, there was an artillery advisor that I'd gone to West Point with. He was a year ahead of me, and as a matter of fact, he's from Manassas, Virginia originally. And so they radioed me in the middle of this while we were shooting at the enemy and calling in artillery. He said, your artillery forward observer, who was with us, a Vietnamese sergeant, has to be Viet Cong because he's trying to adjust the artillery right on your head. So he's putting it right on top of us. Now, we knew we had 15 or 20 Viet Cong in our unit, but we just didn't know who they were out of the 200 or 300. So this guy turned out to be one of them. So I went and told Tao this. So Tao had the guy, they tied him up, took away his carbine, and I called in an American helicopter because the Vietnamese didn't have helicopter support. So it was an American helicopter. And as it was landing, there was blowing smoke up. The guy broke loose. We were still in a firefight, and the guy broke loose from his hands, but he still didn't have a rifle. But he tore open his raincoat. It was during the rainy season. And he had a .45 pistol in a shoulder holster. So he pulled it. I backed up. I didn't know what to do, so I fell backwards over a log. And so I was laying on the ground. The guy was running toward me with his .45 out. Tao saw this all happening, and he couldn't get his .45 out in time, so Tao dove in between us and was shot through the head, saving my life. And then he ran off, and he turned and he shot my radio operator too, who was Vietnamese radio operator. Shot him in the stomach, and I remember the Tao was shot in the head and died instantly, and the radio operator was calling people over to shake hands and say goodbye, and he died in about 5 or 10 minutes. But then the guy didn't, for some reason. I was still standing there by then. I was standing without a weapon, and he ran off, but they shot him, and then they put him in a hole, and they just kept throwing grenades into him, so he was blown to bits. So they never took his body anywhere. We never recovered any Viet Cong bodies anyway. So the Vietnamese battalion at that time, they were probably the best battalion in the Army, one of the best. But they did run that day, because if they were properly led or well led, they were good. But once their leader was killed, why, they were so terrified and scared that they started running, and they were tearing off their clothes, and they had on black underwear so that looked like peasants. They jumped down the rice paddies like they were hoeing. So I knew, I just didn't know what else to do, but I had to run across the paddies because no American could look like a Vietnamese in their underwear or not. So I went back to the hill, but that was the story with Tao. That was the end of him.
And I'm sure that I know that that's left an impact on you.
Oh, yes. Every December the 10th, as a matter of fact, the family. Every Christmas, it's almost spoiled Christmas for me because I can't help but think about it every December. Why? On the 10th, and it just carries through the whole time.
You know, going back a little bit, you said that you were there in an advisory capacity. How, share with our viewers, what exactly, and from my own knowledge, what were some of your duties or responsibilities different from, how is that different from, say, one of the other soldiers or officers?
Well, he was the commander of the battalion, who your advisor. You advised him on, and actually when it boiled down to it, they'd give us, we'd get them helicopter support and things like that. We had to do an artillery, we'd make sure it was run right. But we were purely advisors. When I first went with them in early '66, we weren't supposed to return fire ourselves unless we were being fired at individually ourselves. And to get the combat infantryman's badge, we had General Walt, who was a Marine Corps general up there, and we had to have somebody sign that they knew that you personally were fired at 5 times before they would give you the combat infantry badge. Well, now it's changed a lot. It's just if you're in an infantry unit in combat. But anyway, we were there in advisory capacity in that we didn't command. We just advised them. And then American units were just coming in then. But that's how it all started out from in 1954 when Eisenhower first sent aid over to them. It was all in an advisory capacity. So we would accompany them on every operation and on the hills and everywhere else, but we had no authority over the Vietnamese soldiers. First year, when I say we were in contact with Tao, it was just kind of shooting back and forth behind trees and things. When the North Vietnamese come in, they would lay down their base of fire, they would have their maneuver elements and different things, so that they were highly trained. And it became so much more political that I really got mad because I was flying over one operation and we had a guy, we had 2 men down, shot. So I called back for a medevac. I was flying around and the medevac came in. Well, then out of a hooch there jumped the North Vietnamese in a brown uniform and shot up the helicopter and killed the door gunner on the one ship. So the medevac couldn't land and went around. They were sending another gunship. But they said, we see the guy in the hooch in his brown uniform shooting an AK. Can we return fire? Well, at the time, you weren't allowed to shoot into a hooch. So I had to say, I'll go to Saigon for permission. So I went to Saigon, back to the 173rd headquarters. They said, we'll radio Saigon. So it was within 2 or 3 minutes. The word went back, and the word came back, you can't fire into a hooch under any circumstances. So the gunship said, hell, if we're not allowed to shoot, we're going off station. And the medevac said, I can't go in without gunship support. So so he went off station, and the 2 soldiers bled to death that night. So we could have gotten them out. And I just, and then the other time was we were in a mountain down in a tunnel of caves and having a hell of a firefight down there, and the word came, this was on a Friday afternoon, to pull back. And we said, well, we've got them trapped down there. They said, pull back. This was our headquarters from Saigon. So everybody pulled back and sat there, and then Monday we got the word you can go back in. Well, went back in and they were all gone. Well, the reason they had to come back was the newspapers used to print the casualty rates each week. And it was when the war was being really questioned and fought back here in the United States that they didn't want that week any more American casualties, so they didn't want combat going on. So we pulled back and then went back in the following week, and of course it was too late then. But that's how political it got.
So after this incident with the major, what were your experiences out? I mean, what happened after that?
Well, that's when the battalion just went downhill because the ex-executive officer took over, and he was a young lieutenant and very academic, and he was terrified. So that he wouldn't go to bed at night unless I was in the same bed with him. Well, a Vietnamese bed is nothing more than a table with a mat on it. But he would, and then he would lay down his pistol beside his head. So he cocked it one night when it was pointing my direction, and I said, you know, that's it. I was out of bed that night, but they just, it just went downhill. But it was very close to what they called, I was scheduled to go out the next couple of weeks after this happened. I was scheduled to.
And how old were you at this time? This is like the mid
66. I was 29.
29.
Considered an old man in the Army. But yeah, advisory was, they were sending me out because that was the other thing. On their food, I had what was called amoebic dysentery. So I'd lost in 7 months I'd lost 65 or 70 pounds. So they were going to take me back down to division headquarters and let me eat American food for 2 months before I came back to the U.S. And the Vietnamese government asked that I stay in with that battalion. And I think they wanted to see me killed, quite truthfully, because they were so upset over Tao getting killed. And so I don't know what their thinking was.
Well, that was quite a friendship that you established with him, and I'm wondering, in terms of camaraderie, were there others? I mean, do you make friendships? Do you keep them once you're stateside again, or are they kind of just for when you're there?
He was unique. They weren't all like that. I mean, there was one of the worst. I'd gone on a few operations with him, but he was the son of the mayor of Da Nang, and he wasn't worth a damn. And he and I just didn't like each other. So that, no, and as a matter of fact, Tao was the only Vietnamese I kept track of his name. I can't even remember some of the others, and a lot of them went by nicknames. But no, it wasn't normal. But, to have that much camaraderie, I don't think, or respect. But he was just such a fine person and a fine officer that I was. The only one I'm in contact with was my radio operator when I was second year there, a guy named Luke. We always called him. His name is Melvin Luke. And the way I got Luke is when I went up from, spent a month in the brigade headquarters and then moved up from a battalion, and they came to me and asked me if I didn't have my radio operator selected, would I consider this guy Luke. What Luke had done, he was out with a squad, and they got ambushed, and the whole squad of about 10 or 12 men, where they were 10, 15 miles away from their base camp, but they were all killed or wounded. And Luke was in the best shape of all of them. So Luke called in the medevac in the helicopter, got everybody out of there, did everything right, except for one thing. He forgot to get on the helicopter himself, so that Luke had to walk in. And so they just felt he'd been in the field too long. He wasn't thinking it clearly. Well, so Luke came in as my radio operator, and when I was back in base camp, he'd drive my Jeep too. But I see him once every couple of years now. He's from Alabama. But I hadn't realized it at the time, but he was 17 years old over there when he'd gone through all that. So it was young ages. I had an Australian for my assistant. His name was McFadden, and they called him Blue McFadden. I never did know his real name because he had bright red hair, so that's what they called Blue in Australia. The Vietnamese word was Kovan Ukaloi. That meant Australian advisor. But Blue, for some reason, got alcohol out on the post, or we were on top of the hill living in these bunkers that had I think this was after Tao had been killed. And during the rainy season, the bunkers would have rain or water across the floor, and so that in the middle of the night you'd get hit with thumps on your chest. You'd think that they were, you were afraid they were a grenade. Well, what they were usually were rats jumping around. So, but anyway, McFadden was out there, and somehow he got a hold of liquor, and he'd been drunk 2 or 3 times on me, and this time during the rainy season he got absolutely plowed. Went out of the bunker and rolled into the minefield, and at midnight, well, I had to go into the minefield, and it was unmarked. It was a Vietnamese minefield, and I just said if I got him out, he was the last day he was going to be with me, because so I had to have him relieved, and he was very tearful because he would have probably destroyed his career in the Australian Army, but I'd be damned if I wanted to go in the minefield anymore on a rainy night. So yeah, but normally the Australians are and there's good relations. The 173rd has a reunion, and they have an Australian unit that But in the 173rd Airborne, in the American unit, I never served with the Australians there, but as an advisor I did.
What were living conditions like? I mean, you talked about you had this dysentery. So were you pretty much eating Vietnamese food? What was the...
Yeah, well, we were on a hill, and you couldn't get down off the hill because we were surrounded by Viet Cong. So they'd bring up water in little tiny cans, so you'd have a little water to drink or something. So you couldn't bathe or anything like that. That was out of the question. But they cooked the rice, which we had every day, in big kettles. And I always wondered how they cleaned those kettles. So one night I went out to look at them. Well, they looked like a gray ocean because there must have been 1,000 rats all over them, eating everything. Well, when the sun came up, well, they were real shiny. But so that that's how they cleaned their kettles. The food, we ate a lot of con chuat, which is the Vietnamese word for dogs. Matter of fact, I had a pet dog I was trying to train to sit on the Jeep, and it disappeared. And I swear like heaven that we had it for dinner and I didn't know it. But then we ate a lot of water buffalo because those would get killed.
Is that similar to beef? Or?
Well, it's similar to rubber tire.
Okay.
So that, and then they had what they called Nuc Mam, which when we go through the villages, we were mobile most of the time. We didn't spend it on the hill. Most of the time we went from village to village. And they would have Nuc Mam, and they had the grass huts, and they'd have a pond beside them. It was about 20 or 25 feet long and about 10 feet wide and about 6 feet deep. Well, during the rainy season, this would fill up. And then in it, they would wash their dishes. They would take their baths. They would use it for cooking water. And they raised these little tiny fish. I don't know what the fish were called. But they would catch these fish, throw them in crocks, and just let them rot for 6 months. And that was what they called Nuc Mam, which they pour on rice. And I got where I did like Nuc Mam. But it tasted almost like licorice, but it would kind of burn your eyes a little bit. But then I was taking some out in an American helicopter, and it fell over in a can. And I think in 10 minutes it ate through a magnesium floor in the helicopter, so I wasn't as taken by it anymore.
It's easy to understand how you had dysentery, though.
Yeah, well,
You're describing your menu.
Well, they always used to like to give me the head of the chicken. They'd cook it with half the feathers still on it, and they didn't clean it. They just stick it in a pot and kind of boil it a little bit so lukewarm. And they'd give me, the head of the beak, you were supposed to hold the beak and suck the inside of the head out. And I didn't like to do that. And then after, if we had a big victory, like one operation we killed, I think it was close to 700 North Vietnamese, and we had a big banquet to celebrate it. And they would put, there wasn't a sexual thing involved, but they would bring the high school girls out in white owl dyes, which were their Vietnamese dresses. And they would sit beside you just to add decorum to it. And so I always tried to drink at least a water glass full of whiskey before the banquets because I knew damn well they were going to have something I didn't want. And so that's when they'd give you the chicken head and the river shrimp, which were about the length of a hot dog, and they didn't even cook them. You poured a yellow sauce on them and ate them like a hot dog, the feelers, the eyes, and everything out of the river shrimp. And
so out of courtesy, you really needed to participate in this.
You did to a degree. I did to then. But then what happened at these banquets, there was a guy moving around, and I didn't know why he was moving. There were all this screaming going on. I'd already had my glass of straight whiskey, so had tears in my eyes. But they had down the table, they had half coconuts and on the table, and it was moving around. And I didn't see who was screaming or these high school girls sitting on each side of me, and all of a sudden the coconuts popped open. Well, what it was they had a hole in the table. They had live monkeys under the table. They had their heads in vices, and they were turning the vice, and the heads would pop open and they'd dip in warm monkey brains. Now, I never ever ate those. I just couldn't do that. I think it was Lin Cat 81, but we had the Vietnamese Rangers, who's, God, he would be a story in himself, Colonel Sun Trung. He looked like a Vietnamese Jackie Gleason. He was part Cambodian, part Chinese, part Vietnamese, part French, and the guy was absolutely fearless. The first operation I went on with him, the general was being briefed, and we all came in at midnight for a briefing because we were going to go off at 6 in the morning. Well, all of a sudden the door opened up and 4 guys come in carrying this guy. He was flat out with his hands down, with a white sports coat on, a red rose hanging down. Well, that was Colonel Sun Trung. They had to carry him in. They sat him in a chair, and as soon as he sat in the chair, well, he came alive and was shouting, well, everybody listened to every damn word Sun Trung said. Well, I was out with him on another, not on that big operation, but another one, and we captured I think he was NVA. I don't think he was Viet Cong. But Sun Trung was questioning him, or his people were, and the guy wouldn't talk, wouldn't say a damn thing. So Sun Trung slapped him, and the guy still said a little bit. So Sun Trung pulled in. There were 2 or 3 of us advisors sitting around, or standing around, I mean, not sitting around. And Sun Trung pulled out his pistol. Well, Sun Trung dressed all in black with a black cowboy hat. He had chrome-plated bullets around there, and he had a scarf on, a red scarf, and he had a .357 Magnum, must have been that long. It was chrome-plated. So he pulled out his .357 Magnum, and this guy's eyes got that big. And Sun Trung slapped him and said, gave it to him. He said, now you shoot Colonel Sun Trung. And the guy wouldn't even take the gun. So Sun Trung slapped him again, gave him the pistol, backed off about 20 feet or so, and said, now you try to shoot Colonel Sun Trung. Well, the guy was so damn scared he didn't know what to do, and Sun Trung slapped him a second time and backed off again and said, shoot Colonel Sun. So the guy was nervous as hell. Well, we were all hiding behind trees because we didn't know what the hell the guy was going to do. Well, he fired off 2 or 3 rounds, but they went up in the air and down the dirt and everything. So Sun Trung came forward and slapped him again, took the pistol back, and said, now you go tell all your friends that Colonel Sun Trung cannot be killed. And the guy, I bet he's still running around the mountains over there.
Oh my gosh, what a
I never saw anything like that in my life, but he
could have been shot by the guy.
Well, this big operation that the Ranger Brigade, which he was in charge of, was very instrumental in it, and they'd had a pretty heavy kill, but they had this entire battalion trapped, and Colonel Sun Trung could have pushed right forward. We had all the artillery support and everything, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They said push forward, and he wouldn't move. And so I think it was Colonel Tuan, the division commander, came over to me and said, can you get Sun Trung to move? I said, how the hell am I going to if you can't? You're his commander. I didn't put in those words. But anyway, Sun Trung would not move. He wouldn't say why. So he just held his position. And during the night, that entire battalion escaped that he could have decimated. And the reason was that Sun Trung knew there was fresh fruit and ice cream back in Quang Ngai that they would bring out in helicopters, and he knew if they got engaged for a couple hours that they wouldn't bring it in at night. So he wanted his fresh fruit and his ice cream for his troops. So he brought them out. They brought them out, and they had it that night and let the guys escape. But he was a hell of a commander, a hell of a tough guy. We were down in Quang Ngai one day, and he had a French villa that he would stay in. I don't know who owned it, but we were just walking by, and there was a bird dog flying over, and Sun Trung was standing out on this balcony in his underwear, looking around to see if anybody was watching him, and nobody was. So he pulled up a carbine and took 2 or 3 shots at this damn Army bird dog. I don't know whether it was Vietnamese or American, but he just was curious to see if he could hit it. Well, he didn't hit it. So
You know, I was wondering too, like with the Viet Cong, did were they taken prisoners? I mean, did you take? What did they
yeah,
do
this
with
big
that?
battle. Well, this big battle. It's not a very nice story. I wouldn't tell, but this big battle that we had the big banquet after, we took about 80 prisoners, and they tied them up and put them in the middle of Quang Ngai City, and they were tied there overnight with guards, and people would walk by. They wanted the people to see them, the Viet Cong. And the next morning, they'd take them 5 or 6 at a time and load them on Vietnamese helicopters. They had H-34s that were left over from Korea, American helicopters. And they'd take them, and then they'd come back unloaded, pick up 10 or 15 more and take them and come back. I had no idea where the hell they were taking them. Well, what they were doing was taking them out to the South China Sea, tied up, and throwing them out into the ocean, tied up. They were brutal. And that's the other time I didn't eat what they were eating. There was a Viet Cong, he was a one-man army, and they finally ripped open they jumped on him. He wouldn't talk, and they finally captured him, and he was going here or there and shooting people, and just a one-man army, and they finally captured him. They took him, they tore his chest open with a bayonet, and tore out his heart, and were passing around, sucking on his heart, because there was brave blood. It would make you brave if you sucked it. I chose to stay a coward. I didn't.
Now, tell me, I mean, because the Vietnam War, as we know from history, was very unpopular. What was the morale of the men like overall?
Well,
or did they think much about what was going on stateside, or they're just there trying to stay alive? And
not really. I had a West Point classmate that wrote probably the best book, I think, written on Vietnam. He was killed after that in the Philippines. His name was Nick Rowe, and he was captured, and they held him 5 years in a bamboo cage. Never came out of South Vietnam. And Nick had absolute hatred for Jane Fonda, and he wrote a book after his 5 years of freedom. But other than, I don't much care for Jane Fonda because you would get newspapers and things like that. And
my husband can't stand her either because of her activism over there.
Yeah, well, I didn't care what she did, but sitting at that gun saying, I think in Vietnam Vietnamese, she said, I am a Viet Cong or something. And they made a big play out of that. Well, that helps the enemy and gives them strength because we captured a lot of documents that said, you know, if you just keep fighting a little while longer, the Americans will give up. So that really aided the enemy. So I just, but no, I think the morale was all, and it was full of draftees, and I never saw anybody really against the war or anything against it over there. I mean, you know, you would fight to stay alive. So.
You know, I noticed, I don't want us to forget this in this interview, when you came in, you're sporting these neat little bracelets. And they have a neat story.
Well, I was in I Corps the first year with the Vietnamese. But I Corps is the northern sector of South Vietnam and in the mountains. In the second year, I was in II Corps, which was also in the mountains. But in the mountains is a group called the Mountain Yards, and they had different tribes. And the Mountain Yards, they actually ran around bare feet, no shirts, loincloths. And the Vietnamese, it was amazed me that the Vietnamese didn't know them well at all. As a matter of fact, when Tao went up there with me in an American helicopter, he'd never been to a Mountain Yard village before. But while I was there, they asked me if I wanted to join their tribe. So they gave me after I got in so in their grass hut that the chief of the tribe was in, he brought in a steel pot, an American steel helmet full of a dried grass-like thing, and they poured water into it, and it fermented instantly. It was one of the strongest wines I'd ever had in my life. And they gave me a reed, and I had, I think, 15 minutes to drink the whole helmet full. And then once you drank the whole helmet full, they gave me a crossbow, and they hammered these bracelets on my wrist to make me an honorary tribe member. And So I liked, and the Hmong, our special forces worked with the Montagnards. They were just as tough as nails, and they were good soldiers. But they and the South Vietnamese just never intermingled. But there's a lot of Hmongs. There's 40 or 50,000 of them in the United States, and I think in Minnesota and North Carolina in the mountains. And I always wanted to visit to see if they were still dressed in loincloths or not, but I don't know.
So you managed to drink the helmet full of
yes,
whatever that was.
It was the most powerful stuff I ever drank in my life, and I think I said it was funny. Just a month or so ago at a local establishment, I ran into a guy that noticed my bracelets, and he said, "You must have gone through their ceremony." And I said, "Yeah, did you go?" And he said, "No." He said he started into it, and he got sick and excused himself, went outside the hut and threw up and tried to come back in, but they wouldn't let him continue. And he went back the next day to start over again, and they said, "No, you only do it once, so if you don't make it, you don't make it." So they wouldn't let him into the tribe. So
that's fascinating. So what year was it that you came back then?
the second year was 1970.
Okay, so 1970.
Yeah. And it was...
So when you came back stateside, how was that in terms of reception? Just low key, or because I know some returning military had bad experiences because of the unpopularity of that war.
More the first year I ran into that when I landed in California. They threw tomatoes at us. They spit at us. And at Dickinson College, the same thing. They threw vegetables at us and would try to trip us when we were marching the cadets and things. So, yeah, there was real hostility then. Nobody thanked you for your service, that was for sure. And the second year, but I came in through Seattle, Washington the second year, so I didn't run into as much there.
And then what brought you to Culpeper?
Well, I was at...
and I'm probably jumping ahead, but you came back through Seattle,
No, my
Washington.
last 5 years in the Army were at Fort Belvoir in the Computer Systems Command, and which was a disaster because I can't even spell a computer, let alone know how they run. So, but I was supposed to have a staff job, and but I tell people by the time I was 38, I'd been shot twice, fractured my neck twice, and had a heart attack. So they decided that they would retire me in 1975 on...
Where were you shot? Which parts of your body were you shot?
Well, first time shot in the foot. The second time I called being shot, but I got hit by a mortar shell, and fragments were in my arm, but I got picked up and landed on my head, so that's the second time I fractured my neck. But when you're 20 years old, you didn't know. I just knew my neck hurt, and first time was in a parachute accident, and I knew it hurt, but both times I just shook it off and stayed on duty. And then at Fort Belvoir, I was smoking a cigar, and I had the cigar burn right through my fingers and didn't even feel it because they started measuring me, and I lost 85% of the nerves in my left side of my body. So that's my favorite Culpeper story to a certain group of people. Most of them aren't here anymore, but I was going to Walter Reed, and there was one orthopedic surgeon over there that kept hollering at me. I needed an operation. I needed this operation on my C6 and C7. And he said, "You're going to become a quadriplegic if you don't have this operation." So he pleaded with me for close to 3 years, and finally I decided I was going to have the damn operation. So I got in my truck and drove over to Walter Reed, and I checked in Sunday night. They put IVs in me and gave me stuff to make me sleep, and the wing of the hospital I was in. And so I was in a hospital gown. So then at 9 o'clock at night, they shook me awake and said the neurosurgeons want to talk to you. So So I got out of bed, walked down the hallway, and of course it was full of GIs, and I had my rear end hanging out of one of those hospital gowns, so I felt real neat. But I went down the hall, down the steps, out through the parking lot, back up. This was all with the IVs, and up to the second floor, and these 3 doctors were there. Well, one, the main doctor that had been begging me for 2 years, he was now the head doctor, and he was the brain doctor. There were 2 young doctors with him, and so they said, we just want to make sure you know the dangers. So I'll never forget, I can remember, they said, your damage is C6 and C7. They said, between it and your spinal cord is a tissue paper thin. And they said that they have to go through the front of my throat through 8 inches to get to my damage. And they said they would clean out the damage then, and then they'd go ahead and fuse it while they were back there, and then come back out. They said, but you're going to need it again in about 2 or 3 years to do it a second time. So so I said, well, what? So they said, I said, you know, what are the dangers? And they said, well, if you drop a quarter, 12 inches, that much force will snap your spinal cord. So we're going through 8 inches and to a tissue paper between that. And I said, well, what happens if you slip or nudge it? And they said, well, you'd be an instant quadriplegic. But they said, you won't have any more pain. Well, I said, well, it's still a better lifestyle walking around with pain than being a quadriplegic. And I said, all right, which one of you doctors are going to do it? Well, this young doctor, I can still see him, I don't know his name, he said he would be doing it. He was one that felt it was pretty dangerous. And I said, where'd you go to undergraduate school? He said, I went to Virginia Tech. I said, that's it, I'm the hell out of here. I said, I've heard of good veterinarians coming out of Virginia Tech, but I never heard of an orthopedic surgeon coming out of there. At that time, there weren't any, but I guess now they have a real fine medical school. But so I got up and went back down the hall and down outside and back up and down the thing, and I lit a cigar in bed, and well, the nurse shook me awake. I fell asleep with the cigar and burned the sheets, and she said, if they don't put you out tomorrow, I'll put you out tomorrow. So I got a piece of paper that says I'm welcome back whenever I'm ready to have the operation.
So you didn't have that then?
That was 1976 or 75, I guess.
So how was the adjustment to civilian life when you got back?
Well, I didn't find it too difficult because I wasn't a great military person, I guess, so I was probably a civilian in a military uniform all along. But no, I didn't find it too tough an adjustment. I mean, I had a farm here, and I was in the coal business in Pennsylvania when I first got out, and so I dealt mainly with farmers and miners. But no, although, you know, some people will argue I'm not very much good civilian or whatever I'm supposed to be.
I think you've done a fine job because I know you've been a farmer here, but then you got pretty quickly involved in local government.
Well, the reason I got into that was I felt it'd be a joke on the academic world if I got a master's degree, because the University of Virginia offered some program where you could go to night school, and they sent their professors up from Charlottesville. They didn't bring in substitute professors, they sent them. And so I think it took like 36 credits, and I think I had close to 30 before they'd accept me into the program, because they weren't sure my undergraduate record was so poor that I tell people at West Point that I graduated 23rd in my class out of 550, which sounds very impressive.
Yes, it does.
But it was 23 from the bottom. That's the only thing. So anyway, they made me prove I could do the work, so I had 30 out of 36 credits. You had to carry a B in all the subjects. But anyway, I had that degree in urban planning, so I got on the planning commission here. Well, then the farmers out my way, there was about 8 or 10 of them that land use evaluation was just a 4-3 vote because people thought that was a good deal for farmers, land use, and it shouldn't be there. Well, farmers can't survive without it. But one of the supervisors from Stevensburg had died, and Roy Burke, and so they were afraid that if the vote went the other way, 4-3, that they'd lose their land use. So they talked me into running, and I said that'd be fine. I'd go ahead and run for one term. And
it's been several since then.
so it's been 35 years.
35
it's been
years.
9 terms since. But so that's how I got into it. And
what about your involvement with the military afterwards? Did you do reserves or become members of any, like
no,
American Legion or any of those?
I tried to. Actually, I tried to see if I could get back in one time, and they said no. They said the only time we'll call on you is if the Viet Cong attack Stevensburg. Then we'll go in. But no, I joined the VFW and the American Legion and Purple Heart organization, Disabled American Veterans. So I do belong to all these and give money to all these, although I'm not active. I just have too much trouble getting around anymore to be active in their meetings and things.
What do you have any kind of, if you could talk to young people coming up now, your views on military service?
Oh, I think I would, if I were the final caller on what to do, I would absolutely put the draft back in. It'd be universal military training in it. Everybody, regardless of disabilities or anything else, would go in. I think Israel does that. And what it would be, I mean, even though, like me on a cane now, I could sit and answer a telephone or something like that. But you see all phases of life, and it would have saved me as a parent a lot of money for my kids to go into the military before they went to college, because there's a lot of growing up to be done. But you see the when I had the basic training company, that was what made me a real believer, because I always had maybe 8 or 10 West Virginia mountaineers that worship rattlesnakes. I always had them in there. I always had, from the mountains of Kentucky and the mountains of West Virginia, I always had 8 or 10 people never picked up a knife or fork, didn't know how. We had to give them classes on how to eat. We had the hoods from Chicago, downtown Chicago, that really thought they were better than everybody else, and they weren't that strong. And we had, so we had such a cross section, and put them all together gives you a better understanding of what the society or different societies are like. And I think everybody should be exposed to that. It'd be a better understanding in a friendlier world. Because I had, I'll never forget, a boy from West Virginia come in crying. We had 3 tests. We had a written test, a rifle test, and a physical test. And he was crying because he couldn't read. He was from West Virginia, and I felt so sorry for him. I said, we're allowed, which we were, to read the questions to you. I said, they'll teach you. So I said, you'll be trained well enough you can get by all right. So by somebody reading you the question and without cheating or anything. And I said, I'll bet you used to go out squirrel hunting with your father. Oh yes, he said, we'd go all the time squirrel hunting. I said, well, hell, these guys from Chicago have never shot a gun in their life, or from Detroit, I guess now they have, but they didn't at that time. I said, most of them don't even know which end of a military rifle a bullet comes out of. And he looked at me with dead seriousness and said, sir, he said, now on a military rifle, which end does the bullet come out of? So, but he did, he passed all right, and he did all right, so I was very happy with that. I never lost a trainee, and I was very happy about that. But I think there's nothing wrong with training everybody, and I've had, since then, I've had several, I don't have any friends high up in the military anymore, but they said even if you just gave them 6 months training, it would help the military so much. And so, I'm very much in favor of universal military training. And my advice to any high school student now would be at least take ROTC and get exposed to it in high school here.
Well, I think there's a lot of growing up that happens. I know our son, he's had well, he's in the reserves now, but he had a 5-year stint in there. And I think it does a lot. I mean,
yeah.
it does a lot to show them different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so do you have any other thing that you'd like to share with the viewers that we haven't touched on?
Not really. Anything you want to know, I'm open to
I
questions.
know you got several medals when you were over there. You were decorated, even though you don't think your experience was very glorious.
Well, yeah, I got, I guess, 4 Bronze Stars and 9 Air Medals, but the medals that meant the most to me were the Vietnamese medals I got. One was a Cross of Gallantry with Palm, which is the highest gallantry medal they give, and then a Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star, and then an Honor Medal too. But the reason they meant so much to me is because Tao put me in for them, and he felt that different actions deserved them, so that's why they meant so much to me. But the rest,
Have you been back? Have you been back to Vietnam?
No.
Any desire to go back there, or?
Well, I can't even find a map that shows me what things were like then. All these maps these days are tourist maps, and but I guess I wouldn't mind going back, but I couldn't walk around, and I don't want to go through the 20-hour flight to get there, so I probably won't go back. But I'd more be interested in going back to the South Sea Islands, Samoa and Fiji.
Yeah, those are beautiful areas. All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been
thank you.
Very enjoyable, and thank you for sharing. It's been a privilege just to listen to it.
Well, I enjoyed it.
And thank you to our viewers, and we hope that you enjoyed this and that you'll enjoy future interviews.